thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about friction, identity, and access management. I'm Lydia. I'm a backend engineer on the identity and access management team at FAST. And before FAST, I was working on the identity, security, and compliance team at Slack for about 4 years. So identity is something I'm super excited about, and I'm happy to be here today sharing it with you. So FAST is building a one-click checkout and login product. At the core of all of this is a motivating factor of reducing friction online. On the other hand, identity and access management often relies on introducing friction in the name of security. I spend a lot of time thinking about the role friction plays in identity and access management systems, and whether at FAST, where we have an identity product in a lot of ways, we can do that without making the experience super filled with friction and annoying for the end user, while still being safe and secure and protecting our users' data. So first, let's have a quick overview of what is identity and access management. In short, it's authentication and authorization, but those are annoying terms to keep track of. So authentication is the core of identity. And this is kind of proving the identity of the user. They are who they say they are, and they are someone you understand in your system. On the other hand, we have authorization. Authorization is kind of the access management part of things. It is determining what that user who's been verified has access to do and see within your system. So let's go through the basic user authentication and authorization flow for your standard web application. This is not a perfect representation of every system, and I've glossed over some things, but I think this will make sure we're all on the same page about the basics. So the first step is that the user needs to prove their identity to you. There are a lot of different methods to verify identity. They can be broken down into 3 different types of evidence or factors based on what they can theoretically prove. So something you know, something you have, and something you are. Single factor authentication is when the user only needs to provide a single one of these factors in order to successfully authenticate. So the most common single factor authentication is username and password, something you know. But when you use Face ID, that's also single factor. Even though it's biometrics, it's only proving one of those factors. Multi-factor requires using 2 or more factors of authentication, with the premise being that this is more secure, as it makes it far more difficult for a malicious actor to fake your identity. You need to both have access to something you know and something that you've said that you have, like a YubiKey or your phone. So the user has sent the credentials to our backend system. We've verified that they match what we expect for that user. Now, HTTP is stateless, so every request is independent and no information is from the previous requests are saved. But we're not asking you for your username and password on every request. So what's happening? Essentially, the server creates and stores a secure expiring identifier, which is generally a token or a session cookie that is linked to the identity that was just authenticated. Then return that to the client. It's going to store it in the browser and include it on every subsequent request to the server. For every subsequent request, this cookie or token is generally in your headers, typically the authorization header. The way that the server determines the validity of this proof is slightly different for cookies versus tokens. Session cookies might be stored in a database and looked up, and then we check the user ID expiration date from there, whereas tokens, which are most commonly JSON web tokens, allow you to store some information about the user within the token claims. Once you've verified that this token is legitimate and not expired, you now know who owns it. And you can use that to determine if they have access to the data or action requested. Worth noting that tokens are a little different here as well, since they can have specific scopes tied to them. So it will explicitly lay out what access is allowed for this token. A user may have multiple different tokens that have different scopes. So access control is largely not visible to the user outside of the kind of like options that return to you in your user flow. So for example, people who haven't approved to follow me on Instagram should not have access to my photos, but I don't actually have much visibility into Instagram's like backend system that is doing that access control. So this is just kind of a high level flow. The user sending some form of authentication, gets the cookie back, and then for subsequent requests, sends that back to the application in order to get the data they're looking for. So at this point, I hope it's pretty clear that authentication and authorization are incredibly important. It's what keeps your users safe. Make sure that only they have access to the data that they've entrusted you with. So that's pretty scary, right? So a common response is to just introduce more steps and more friction. The harder it is to prove you are who you say you are, the more deterrent you'll have for malicious actors, right? Well, sort of, right? But people also hate friction. And if they hate it enough, they just won't use something that introduces a lot of friction, even if they know it's good for them. Well, I religiously use a password manager and app-based 2FA. I'm not gonna lie, they have a point. It's annoying. I have 300 logins, and my 2FA app disconnects all the time. People also have a lot of anxiety about recovery mechanisms for these things and don't really understand how they're supposed to use it. So I think that there's a few questions you should generally ask yourself before adding friction to authentication. It's not that it's never a good idea, but I think it is often used without properly thinking through what the impact on the user is and how that changes how much security you're actually getting from the friction. So the first question is, what will your users actually do? So in theory, if you just have people set a password that's 12 characters long with just upper and lowercase letters, it would take a hacker like 300 years to crack the password through brute force, whereas a 6-character password can be cracked nearly instantly. Great, sounds like a worthwhile trade-off in friction, right? Have people add 6 extra characters and the password becomes nearly uncrackable in like normal terms. Big problem here is what your users are actually doing, which is most people reuse their passwords. And just seeing if the same key opens a different door is much easier and fruitful strategy for hackers than brute force. Microsoft discovered that 44 million of their users in 2019 were using passwords that had already been leaked online in previous breaches. And things like mandatory password resets don't do much to address this. Around 50% of people will just add 1 character to their password when they're prompted, which obviously makes it a lot easier to try and find combinations that might work. So next point to ask yourself, is friction pushing users towards less secure options? So in this example, let's say you've read an article about how SMS-based 2FA isn't actually that secure because of SIM swapping. You would be correct, but now you've decided that you're going to switch your 2FA over to app-based and have that be the default. You feel really proud of yourself. Your users are going to be super secure now. But your end user is like, great, before I got to quick code in my text messages, I have an iPhone, Apple already fills it in for me. It's not that much work and I feel much safer. But now you want me to download an authenticator app. scan a QR code, and then enter a PIN. It's coming from this like anxiety-provoking countdown. And if the app disconnects, you lose access to your account unless I save those like recovery codes somewhere safe where I'll always have access. A lot of places recommend you print them out, which like, I don't know anyone who owns a printer. Fun fact, I was locked out of my GitHub for 6 months because of this. And if you're making this your only option, users are less likely to have two-factor authentication at all than if you had the slightly less secure, but like still something method of SMS-based. So next question is, what does this friction prove? So when you're thinking about a verification method, it's important to think about like what you're actually learning and what is, being proven to you by the user completing this step. And I think it's important to factor in recovery mechanisms that you allow as well. So for example, in a password use case, in theory, you're proving that like the user has access to the super secret key that only the valid user has, knows, and so it must be the true owner. In reality, might be a super guessable password that's been linked online before, but also consider the recovery options you have. Almost every like username and password system also has a recovery mechanism of it emailing a reset link to the email associated with the account. So at the end of the day, you could be proving that the person knows something that is the password to your application, or you could be proving that they know something else, which is the password to their email account. So I think it's important to be clear about that and to maybe cut out as many duplicated types of proof as you can. What is the risk of keeping this action low friction? Different actions come with different risk levels. If you treat everything with the authentication standards you would feel comfortable with for a low risk action like delaying the subscription box, then you're probably not doing enough to protect your users for higher risk actions. On the other hand, if you treat everything with like the utmost, most intense, most friction-filled security, then your users are probably going to hate using your platform and going to opt out of additional security measures because it's just adding too much friction to their day-to-day lives. So it's important to kind of consider each action in isolation and see if you can build a system that really allows you to treat different cases differently. Finally, have you done the work on your side? So user input is only part of the authentication and authorization flow. There's also a lot there in terms of both the security of your overall system. So following security best practices. You want to be, database security, network security, admin credentials best practices. And then also, I think doing the work to, make sure that your users are as safe as possible if they are adopting these additional security measures. So for example, have backup plans in terms of the types of secondary auth you might be using. If the customer has SMS-based 2FA turned on and you have a dependency on Twilio to send those text messages, what does the customer do if Twilio is down? These should be very well thought through before you ask users to take on this additional friction. You need to do the work first. I think it's also really important. Design is a huge part of this, is making sure that your copy is clear, that the flows are intuitive, and that the users don't feel overwhelmed or confused by what you're asking them to do and why. So some key takeaways. And I think a lot of these apply to things outside of identity and access management, but take on a particular importance when we're talking about something as sensitive as your users' data and access to various tools and information within your system. So first, don't rely on user behavior outside of your control. It's great if you have this brilliant idea for a security system that's going to, require 10 different steps, but if users aren't going to adopt it, then it's not actually that secure. People will find a way around more friction or stop using your service. So optional authentication layers are only useful if people actually adopt them. Don't trick yourself into thinking you are super secure because you offer a service. Look at how many users are actually using it and using it correctly before kind of making that assessment. So simplify based on what you need to know. If you have a 18+ character password requirement, great, that's pretty uncrackable. But you then allow password resets through an email link, just like do the courteous thing and allow authentication via magic link or PIN sent to the email. That is what you're testing for anyways. And people are much more cautious about their email password than they are about a lot of other ones anyways. Keep your authentication flow simple. Have fewer conditionals. It makes it easier to comprehensively analyze potential threats, and regularly do comprehensive threat modeling on all of your services. And each step should actually prove something new. Requiring 2 passwords is not a new factor of authentication, and the benefit there is pretty small. Risk isn't one size fits all, and so friction shouldn't be either. Think critically about what each step of your application does, what the relative risk is, and this applies at an application level, not just and at the feature action level. So one thing that we've been working on at FAST is kind of breaking apart kind of the types of sessions that a user might have or tokens based on particular scopes. So we can allow more frequent authentication requirements for things that are higher risk, having people go through additional kind of step-up authentication. But we're not slowing down kind of the normal everyday things that people do on the internet that we can kind of catch with our risk modeling. So being targeted about where you introduce friction is really important for making your users' lives more pleasant, and it might trust them, or make them more likely to trust you to add additional authentication requirements because they know that it's not going to hinder their ability to use your application during normal times. And last, be a good host. Don't ask your users to adopt friction-filled flows before you've done what you can to make the process as smooth as possible for them. This is your job, and you can take on the work for them a lot of the times. So internal security best practices, smarter backends, risk adjustment and risk modeling, UX flows, and pay particular attention to the friction introduced by failure modes that might chase people away from more secure authentication. Don't just build, and then I think the last thing, particularly when thinking about authentication and authorization, is don't just build what you want. If you are someone who's working in the identity and access management space, you're probably more concerned with this than the average consumer. So listen to your user and figure out how to make them feel safe as possible given their preferences and their comfort level with this technology, and build for their actual needs, not what you think they should do. So if you thought this was interesting and you want to think about similar challenges at FAST, either connect with me or look at fast.co/careers. And if you're interested in pushing authentication work from your application to FAST, you can check out our docs at fast.co/docs. I really appreciate you all listening today, and I hope you have a great day.